Hello everyone, and thank you for your interest in this webinar. I will now share my screen. Voilà. So yes, I hope that this webinar will give you some responses on whether finance can contribute to the transition to low carbon economy, and if this is not the case, what measures should be put in place to promote this transition. So I would like to start the webinar with a very simple question. So will finance save the planet? Our response to this question is simply no, because in the current economic system, which is unsustainable, unfortunately, the sustainable investments are still less profitable than unsustainable ones. So even if now we see at political level many efforts to try to involve finance more in achieving sustainability goals, without effective public measures which aim to address these what we call market failures, it's very difficult to believe that finance by itself will be able to contribute to this transition. So the idea is really that we need to keep in mind that transition is not really about pushing higher demand for the green assets, but it's really promoting a shift of the capitals from unsustainable investments towards sustainable ones. This is just to give you a short overview of the content of the webinar. In the first place, we will discuss what the challenges that we are facing now and what are the main environment goals that we need to achieve in the short term as soon as possible. In the second moment, we will describe briefly what is the political momentum that is supporting the transition to a more sustainable economy. And finally, we will describe the current EU agenda on finance and sustainability, and we will reflect on its effectiveness. So one of the main challenges that we need to address as soon as possible is the reduction of the CO2 emissions. As highlighted by scientists and by economists, reducing CO2 emissions is really the biggest challenges we're facing now, and really the fight against climate change can be seen as the greatest sustainability worldwide project. This is not to say that fighting climate change should have priorities over other goals. But if we are not successful in reducing the CO2 emissions, then it is very difficult to believe that any other sustainability goal can be actually pursued. The EU has set in some important targets in terms of reduction of CO2 emissions, and these targets are reducing the emissions by 40% by 2030, and reducing emissions by, compared to 19 level, and to reducing the emissions by 80–90% by 250. However, when we look at these charts, unfortunately, we see that without major efforts, these targets will not be achieved. It also needs to be highlighted that these targets are based on the EU communication of 2011. So we need to remember that actually these need to be revised because it needs to be more ambitious in order to take into account the Paris Agreement goals, because this means that we need to achieve the carbon neutrality by mid-century. What are the key elements that can make our economy less dependent on carbon? So what are basically the pillars of the decarbonization process? We need in first place to decarbonize the power sector, improve energy efficiency in all sectors, and decarbonize the transport sector, and protect the environment's carbon sinks. So, but in order to achieve that, more investments are needed. Or it's better to say we need to shift the investment from unsustainable investment or sustainable ones. At global level, it has been estimated that these financial needs to promote the transition are around $5 trillion between 2015 and 2030. However, at EU level, we hear very often the amount of 180 billion per year to achieve only the energy targets by 2030. So we can imagine that this number needs to be revised to consider the Paris Agreement goals. But the key question that we should ask ourselves, why actually do we need to talk about finance and sustainability? Why can't finance itself look more at this type of investments? And in order to understand the logic of why this is happening, it is very important to recall the concept of negative externality, because in this way it will be possible to understand how the different policies are connected, and why actually we are saying that our economic system is unsustainable. Because when we say that the economic system is unsustainable, we mean that actually it's imposing severe negative externalities and so compromising the possibility of future generations to meet their needs. So from an economic perspective, the definition of negative externality is a cost that is suffered by third party as a result of economic transaction. In order to see how this concept is important for understanding the implications on the return on investments, we can imagine that, for example, any company is free, anyone, any economic party will say it's free to pollute as much as they want, unless there are stringent legislation in place that actually impose incentives to economic agents to internalize these costs, because these situations happen in case of specific type of goods, like environment, and we can see immediately that without a proper public policy, it is very difficult to believe that the companies would be incentivized to adopt behavior which are environment friendly by themselves. They need really incentives to do this. So just to try to make things a bit more concrete, we can think about a company that is producing a product and selling it on the market, but the environment legislation is not so strong, so the company actually can pollute. And because of that, what's happening is that the price actually of that product does not reflect the social cost, because part of this cost is transferred to the society. It means that the company can exploit these situations and have actually higher profits if compared, for example, to a company that would, by its own initiative, take the necessary measures. So for this reason, we need to highlight that only public measures, for example, in form of taxes, standards, emissions, or quotas, can actually incentivize the companies to internalize the cost and really create a fair situation between unsustainable and unsustainable investment. Only by making sustainable investments more profitable, we will be able to attract the financial market as well. Just to give another example of one of the measures that are really needed for the transition to low carbon economy, and that should aim at making the sustainable investments more profitable, is the EU carbon pricing system. This was introduced in 2005. It covers around 11,000 installations, especially power plants, in energy intensive industries, chemicals, paper, steel. Basically, the idea of the system is to create a total cap on the emissions and to reduce this cap progressively over the years. So in theory, the price of CO2 should increase, and in the allowances also price should be so high to be basically an incentive for the companies to make the transition, for example, to less polluting fuels, or for example to low carbon technologies. Or anyway, the idea really of the carbon price is that it should be an incentive, as highlighted by the Commission in the communication 2011. It should be very driver in promoting the new technologies, the new low carbon technologies on the market. However, for a number of reasons that are out of scope of this webinar, we cannot say that the CO2 price played really its role. So it was really until now never a strong price signal from the financial sectors, and it should achieve by 2030 levels which are much higher from what we see now. So it is really important to keep in mind that without an effective pricing of negative externalities in the case of CO2 emissions, it is very hard to believe it's possible that the financial sectors will focus the investments in coming years in the sustainable investments, unless, as I said, unless we adopt other type of measures that can price adequately these negative externalities. Before looking specifically at what EU is doing, we'd like just to recall briefly the political international momentum that is supporting the transition to sustainable economy. So these are the Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Agreement. Sustainable Development Goals include a number of targets which, if achieved, should make our economy more sustainable. So it's really about promoting, let's say, fight against hunger, mortality of kids, and especially also under, for example, under the goals number 13, there is an important need to fight climate change. So these need to be seen as a very ambitious goals that should help move our economy towards a more sustainable pattern. And then we know we have the Paris Agreement with a well-known 2-degree and 1.5-degree goals. And also the same agreement is highlighting that the parties should take the necessary measures to make sure that also the financial capitals, so the investments are aligned with the 2-degree scenarios. So as we have seen now that really the key priority of the policy maker should be make sure that adequate measures that can take form, for example, as I said before, taxes or quotas or standards, that the right measures are put in place, because it's very important the way how these are designed, because only if designed in an adequate way, they can be really effective. When we look at the EU work, we see on finance and sustainability, Commission has set up in 2016 an expert group on sustainable finance, which delivered recommendations on how the financial system should be reviewed in order to promote the shift to the capitals. And based on these recommendations, Commission presented the action plans on financing sustainable growth. The first legislative acts are expected in May 2018. But until now, actually, we didn't define sustainable finance. We didn't define because actually sustainable finance is not defined. There is no worldwide definition, and there are no quantitative metrics that now can help us to say if one investment is sustainable or not. There are so many definitions that we see on the market. United Nations highlights the need that sustainable finance is about financial services which are aligned with sustainable development goals, included Paris Agreement. While if we look at the European Commission Action Plan, we see that the Commission is referring on the need to take into account sustainability factors. So in this sense, we might say that the Commission definition is slightly weaker, because the consideration of sustainability factors does not mean automatically that the final decision actually is aligned with sustainability goals. And here we have some examples of what we see on the market, for example, green bonds, social impact bonds, different types of social responsible investment funds. However, given that there is really no clarity on the market on what sustainable asset is, there is a very, of course, high risk of greenwashing. If now we look more closely at the objective of the action plan, we see three main goals. The first, which is the orientation of capital flows, and the second is management of financial risk deriving from sustainability factors, and the third one is about transparency. Now, while we welcome very much the first goal, we see that actually the Commission Action Plan is very much focused on how the corporation, financial corporation shall deal with sustainability factors in order to improve their risk management tools. So it's really seen more by the Commission as the need by the financial institutions to take into account these factors in order to better improve the financial risk management. And there are other measures which really aim to promote transparency. For example, the companies in terms of disclosure of their sustainability profile. But what really needs to be highlighted in our view is the important point to make a distinction when we talk about different types of stakeholders and when we talk about time frame of the materialization of this impact. Because if you look at the Commission Action Plan on page 2, we see that Commission says that very often sustainability factors are not taken into account in the investment decisions because these are likely to materialize in the future. But it's very important to highlight that the concept of materialization is very relative because if, for example, we can think that some impacts of the climate change will have are materially financial in the future for the financial institutions, this is actually, many of these impacts are material to the society now. If you think about the impact of climate change on coral reefs, this is already a loss that we are experiencing now. So it's really important that on one hand, we make clear distinction about what stakeholders we are referring to and what type of impact. Because here, as I said, the society is already bearing this type of losses, which is the loss, for example, of the biodiversity. With regard, when we look specifically at the single initiatives of the Commission, so the first one is concerned about sustainability taxonomy, and this is a very welcome initiative, given, as I mentioned before, given the lack of the clarity in the market about what sustainable assets is. The Commission will focus initially on the criteria of adaptation and mitigation, but then it will cover other type of environmental impacts like pollution prevention, resource management, and protection of biodiversity. For creating these criteria, the Commission will set up an expert group, and the final criteria will be very important because they then will be the basis for many other measures like green bonds or eco-labels for financial products. But we think that the positive criteria should be also complement the negative criteria, because if the idea is to provide more information and more clarity to the market, then it needs to be clarified also what is, for example, going against the Paris Agreement. The second legislative proposal, that will come in May, concerns the interpretation of the legal duties of institutional investors and asset managers. So we can say that in the current legislative framework, there is no actually an obstacle for the investor duties and asset managers to consider sustainability factors. But it's also true that in reality, the concept of best interest is interpreted very often just as a maximization of the returns and minimization of the risk. We think that any legal interpretation that will come up should make clear that institutional investors and asset managers need to take into account the non-financial interests of their clients, And this is particularly important if we have to face a weak environment legislation. So this is one important point that should be included, and also the active ownership also should be definitely included in the legal proposal. So with regard to other actions, the Commission will also see whether, for example, the regulation of the credit rating agencies should be reviewed to consider sustainability factors. Now, on this point, like in the case of legal duties, there is actually no legal obstacle for the credit rating agencies to take sustainability factors into account when doing the assessment of the creditworthiness of the debtors. So it will be in this case only a question of providing an additional clarification. Then also in the context of the MiFID II, the Commission will probably expand the concept of suitability assessment. So to include explicitly the provisions that investment firms needs to take into account also the sustainability preferences of their clients. And on the corporate disclosure, the Commission will work on the guidance from Financial Information Directive to include the recommendation, task force of climate-related disclosure, and according to this recommendation, the corporation, financial and non-financial, shall show how they are financially resilient when putting into the, for example, the physical risk of climate change and the transition risk. And they also should show how they are managing the opportunities that are arising from the transition. And finally, the Commission will also explore whether the capital requirements rules should be changed. On this, to change to reflect better to reflect the credit risk associated with green assets. On this point, we believe that that no other criteria except from the risk of the credit should be taken into account when calculating the risk-weighted assets. So, for example, also in the past, when the discount measure was proposed for the SMEs, we see that the empirical model showed that that was not really effective on one hand. Then on the other hand, many banks can can do the calculations based on the internal models. So for the time being, we really don't think that other criteria should be used for calculating the capital requirements from the banks, because of course we don't want to risk to destabilize the system, which already needs more capitals, and definitely not less. So I would like to conclude that on one hand, we see the urgent need to adopt measures for pricing negative externalities, but on the other hand, what we see in the political agenda are more measures that are focused on improving clarity of the market, on the transparency of the disclosure. This is not to say that these measures are not welcome. They are well welcome, but they are addressing another problem. They are addressing the problem of what we say information asymmetry. They are addressing the problem of not having enough information in the market to make the decisions. But these type of measures, if not accompanied by adequate pricing, policy of negative externalities, are very unlikely to be able to promote the shifts towards more sustainable investments. So this is the conclusion. But I look forward to hearing the questions a lot.
Yeah, thank you very much, Nina. So I think I invite everyone again to send us your questions, and I have already one coming from Thomas. He's asking, you were mentioning before the CO2 price was too low.
Yeah.
What is the price level that we would like to see and that could contribute more to the transition?
Okay. Yes. Okay. Thank you. Well, yes, the discussion about the price of CO2 is a very difficult one because finally somebody claims that actually also in the directive of the ETS said that actually the main objective of ETS is reducing the emissions. So attributing to ETS another role, such a driver in promoting, let's say, promoting more technologies on low carbon technologies in the market is an additional, let's say, that task that we have attributed to it all the time. But the price that should we have in order to promote a transition is also estimated by the greatest economies should be at least between 30 and 40 euros per ton of CO2 equivalent. Otherwise, any price which is lower than this one will not give incentive enough for promoting the transition because it will be still more convenient for the corporations to buy the allowances and keep polluting instead of doing the necessary investments to reduce these emissions. So unfortunately, we saw that last year the price was quite low. It was around 5 euro per ton, and then now it increased a bit. But when we look at the outlook regarding the allowances that will last until 2030, and it's very difficult to believe that this price will increase soon and will achieve the level needed. We would like, of course, but it's questionable.
And so we have two more questions coming in. One from Magnus on the taxonomy. Okay. So what's your view on a green versus brown taxonomy? I think he's speaking about the green supporting factors and brown penalizing factor. So can you give us your view on this?
Yes. So, well, let's say that the taxonomy should be set based on what the targets are. So, for example, very often we see the proposal to have sectorial taxonomy. But if the target is really reducing the CO2 emissions, then the taxonomy should be really able to cover these targets. So if now some of the possible taxonomy covers certain sectors, the idea really is to be able to cover all possible sectors and consider sustainable investments, for example, all those that work on energy efficiency, so reducing the emissions independently the sector, for example. So that would be one thing. But of course, as I said before, now for the moment, it seems that the Commission will focus on mitigation, so reducing the emissions. So depending, of course, there are different ways, increasing the investments in renewables, improving the energy efficiency. But since really the priority and is about reducing the CO2 emission as soon as possible to achieve the carbon neutrality by mid-century, then I would agree that the first two priorities should be mitigation and adaptation. But of course, as I said before, this is not to say that these need to have a priority, but just if we are not successful in achieving these goals, how can we think about other goals like protection of biodiversity, prevention of pollutions? I mean, it is questionable if this action can be pursued if the CO2 reduction goal is not achieved. And on brown, well, until now we didn't see, of course, concrete proposals on the brown definition, but any type of investment that it keeps financing, say, coal industry, or it's a good example because it goes definitely against the Paris Agreement.
Okay, thank you. Let's go to another one I see from Claire. She's asking, what is the current exposure of the financial sector to climate change? Is there any study that gives an idea about the financial risks that you are aware of?
So until now, we see that the most comprehensive study was done by the Dutch Central Bank. It gives an overview of the exposure of the Dutch financial system to the climate change. In these studies, they found, for example, that in the insurance sector, the catastrophe models, they don't take into account enough the risk arising from climate change. But in the same time, it is interesting to see that they found that 11% of the assets of the banks are linked to the carbon industry, the intensive carbon industry, but the loans are, of course, are like very short-term loans, in average 5 years, and it means that in case of the gradual transition, actually the banking sector might be able to deal with this transition. So, for example, in this sense, we can clearly see like if the priority is about managing the financial risk, and if the banks, for example, keep believing that the CO2 price will be too low, that actually the transition is not fast as it should be to achieve the Paris Agreement goal, they are free to renew the loans to the carbon industry with short deadlines. But this is not what we would like to see. We would like to shift of the capitals towards more sustainable investment. So this is just another example how we need to clarify actually what goals we want to achieve.
Okay, great. I think there is another question quite linked to this one from Luke. Do you think there is a carbon bubble at the moment? And may it create problems for financial market stability? If yes, what can be done? And then he says into brackets, apart from the green discount you criticize. Yeah.
Well, I would say that it depends, because we can say there is a carbon bubble if we will believe that the transition will happen, because the transition risk is the one that will cause quick impairment of those assets. So I would say that it really depends, or depends on how the CO2 price will evolve. It depends on how strong the other public measures will be, because that's really the key thing. If we don't believe that the transition will happen, then on which ground we can say that there is a carbon bubble? So that's really, it really depends, I would say, on how the climate change policies are credible. And we should, of course, the policymakers should send a clear signal that the 2-degree scenario will be pursued with all possible means.
Okay, thank you. We have one from Gilles coming. He's asking about the role of central banks improving climate finance and carbon pricing. Could they play a role, for example, with measures such as green QE?
Yes, so with regard to the role of central banks, so we think that in first place, the central banks, also for a question of consistency, they should also try applying the TCFD recommendations on one hand. Then on the other hand, they should try to explore if the eligibility criteria can be revised indeed to be more in favor of green assets. And especially, and finally, they also can, how can I say, should explore whether this market neutrality principle is questionable or not, because until now, in their asset purchase program, they try to reflect the current structure of the market, for example, the bond. But if we come back to our initial discussions, and if we say that the current markets are distorted, then it means all this principle is highly questionable. So we would like to invite ECB to explore more these issues as well.
Thank you. One other from Holger, I think he's referring to an additional tax of 30%. If you apply it, that would trigger, in his view, a substantial inflation, and who of the acting politicians might want to be held responsible for this? So I think this is more political questions.
Well, yeah, well, I would need to see exactly how 30% exactly on what, and how the different chain reaction would evolve, and I would need to discuss a bit more on this before giving a clear response.
Okay, thank you. And then I see one last, also from Hans. You said before that the consideration of sustainable factor does not automatically mean the decision is aligned with the SDG or the Paris Agreement. And could you give an example, he's asking?
Yeah, so for example, if we take into account the PCFD recommendations, they clearly invite corporations to show how they're financially resilient when looking at physical risk, transition risk. But for example, if in this scenario analysis they need to choose certain parameters, and so they take into account they can take into account all the environmental impacts. They can create the scenarios, build up based on what is likely to happen, so they can do basically their job. They can take into account the climate risk. But then if actually this is not going to happen, that is just a document that improves transparency, but it cannot become an incentive. If they believe that the price of CO2 will be still low, in the scenario analysis, the price of CO2 will be still low, and then they will take a decision based on this scenario, for example. So, or for example, when we were discussing before about the role of the credit rating agencies, if we can think about a company that is polluting in a country with quite weak environmental legislations, and if it's unlikely that this will be strengthened in the future, the fact that the credit rating agency is considering the sustainability element is not going to impact actually the score of the company. So it depends. Or we said before the example of the Dutch banks. From business, a financial perspective, it will make sense for the banks, of course, to give only short-term loans, but they will keep doing it now, even if until they don't think really that transition risk will happen. So what they do, they change the business strategy. They give short-term loans. They will keep renewing it, but so it makes sense from a financial perspective, of course. But this is not what we want to see.
Thank you. We have one comment from Aurélien, a long one, and but is making an important point. In fact, that he says the carbon, everything is a bit linked to carbon emissions, but isn't there also necessity to address other problems and pricing? For example, that finance brings pricing for plastic products, recycling, usual consumption packaging, etc., and make it more attractive to reduce global pollution and increase clean recycling business.
Yeah, I mean, definitely, and it's because of that I also wanted to put this final puzzle, just to say that sustainable pricing one piece. But of course, carbon pricing is only one tool. So the idea is really to put the price on the CO2 emissions. But the logic of pricing negative externalities should be applied in all areas where we need to protect the environment, because it's there where we need the public interventions. So, for example, now we also know the risk of the reprotoxic substances in the environment, for example, impacting the endocrine systems of the fishes, or, for example, the substances that accumulate in the environment with very long-term and uncertain risk. But these are the long-term threats to the environment. And we need sectorial, of course, legislations, but we need to address each problem. And by addressing these problems and making the unsustainable activities very expensive for the industry, in this way, we can make the sustainable investment more profitable. So everything starts with the public interventions.
Thank you very much. I was just saying you were referring to the puzzle, but I think what you can also do, Nina, is just stop sharing your screen, and then we see your video and everybody.
Okay, yes.
But I think we will only have time for 1 or 2 more questions anyway, because we are almost at 45, as we said. So one comes from Luke again, saying much of your proposals are for national parliaments. But what can financial market regulators do? So he's mentioning all the ESAs, EBA, ESMA, but also the Commission or the ECB.
Um, yes, well, it's not an easy question because it really, as I said, it really depends on the goal that we want to achieve. So it's true that during my presentation I was really much focused on what we should expect from the public authorities. But of course, the ESA's role is mainly about the financial stability. So what they can do is, of course, promote technical guidances. For example, from now, how they discussed before, how the stress test can be done of the financial system with regard to the assessment of the carbon bubbles. So, of course, like every institution needs to play a role. And if given the main target is, of course, from their side, is financial stability, they should contribute as much as possible in developing guidances for doing this type of assessment in a consistent way, so that we can deal, of course, well on time with the financial risk around climate change. Because very often we hear, like, if there is a gradual transition, that the financial system will be able to do it, but we actually don't have time. So it's very important that we do all the assessments of these risks now.
Okay, thank you. I think that was a nice word for the end. So thanks a lot, Nina. I just want to remind you that the presentation and the video will be was recorded, and that we will put it online in a few days. You can find it on the Finance Watch website. And yeah, thanks again for joining. And now enjoy the sunny day everywhere.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.